Thank you very much. So we have good news. We've reached a deal.
U.S. President Donald Trump and European Union Chief Ursula von der Leyen have reached a trade deal.
The U.S. and EU narrowly escaped a trade war by finalizing a 15% tariff agreement. President Trump hailed it as the most significant deal ever struck, outlining a new trade structure with the EU. In just 3 weeks, Trump secured deals worth $1.3 trillion with the EU, Japan, and the UK. Yet, Canada, America's largest trading partner, stood firm and declined to join. While Brussels accepted a 15% tariff in return for $750 billion in U.S. energy commitments and $600 billion in investment promises, Ottawa refused to engage. No deal was signed, and no joint press conference occurred. Now, Trump is warning of a 35% tariff on Canadian imports starting August 1st. Surprisingly, Canada isn't rushing to negotiate like the EU. Instead, sources reveal Prime Minister Carney is deliberately stalling, pursuing a calculated long-term strategy. Behind closed doors, Canada is bolstering its Arctic operations, forging new shipping partnerships and energy routes that could outlast Trump's presidency and weaken U.S. control over trade pathways. This isn't merely a disagreement. It's a high-stakes face-off between Trump's aggressive deal-making and Canada's inward-focused resilience. Why is Carney taking this gamble when the EU conceded? And what's quietly unfolding in the Arctic, far from the spotlight of tariffs and cameras? Let's unpack it. Continuing from that point, let's dive into the core of this clash: Trump's bold 15% tariff framework, and how Carney's calculated refusal has turned the tables. Here's what happened. On July 27, 2025, at Turnberry, Trump finalized an agreement with the EU. He didn't impose the 30% tariff he'd been threatening, but settled for 15%. Make no mistake, that's still a heavy blow. This 15% tariff now covers roughly 70% of EU exports to the US. For perspective, before June 2025, those goods faced an average tariff of just 2.5%. It's a sharp increase, and Europe felt the weight. In the deal, Brussels committed to stronger energy ties and increased purchases from the U.S. in sectors like fuel, technology, and defense, moves seen as efforts to gain favor in Washington. These massive pledges shaped the trade shift. Europe's leaders agreed to significant obligations to dodge harsher tariffs, a tactic mirroring Trump's strategy with Japan, the UK, and Vietnam. Wield the threat of trade penalties, then secure a moderated deal with major contracts. But Carney took a different path. While the EU relented, Carney stood his ground, refusing to fall into the same trap. His approach avoided locking Canada into heavy commitments that would tie it to a dependent position. U.S. negotiators, accustomed to opponents yielding, were caught off guard by Canada's firm stance. Ottawa sidestepped the framework entirely, prioritizing supply chain sovereignty over temporary tariff relief. This has positioned Carney as not just an equal, but a shrewder player in Washington's eyes. The stakes are high. If other allies follow Canada's lead, the U.S.'s tariff threats could lose their edge, turning leverage into hollow warnings. In essence, Carney rejected Trump's 15% deal. The EU gave in, securing billions. Canada didn't. The U.S. is rattled, and that's the true story. Building on this trade framework discussion, let's focus on Canada's daring pivot. Under intense pressure from Washington in early July, Canada held firm, rejecting a rushed agreement. Ottawa's government declared negotiations were strained, insisting on a fair and stable deal rather than one forced by tight deadlines. Instead of hurrying to comply, Canada opted to delay any hasty pact. The Prime Minister stressed a cautious approach, noting that rushed decisions would harm long-term interests. Meanwhile, provinces united in a coordinated national effort. By mid-March, Canada collaborated with provinces to identify critical industries needing protection. This led to a domestic strategy to secure supply chains without relying on U.S. imports. By July 1st, internal trade barriers were slated for removal, a move expected to reduce costs by up to 15% and lift national productivity by 4 to 8%. Behind the scenes, Alberta, Ontario, and British Columbia developed contingency plans, targeting vulnerable sectors like auto parts, steel, aluminum, and forestry. The plan was clear: strengthen local supply chains rather than yield to U.S. demands. This stance reflects a deliberate retreat from Trump's threat-driven diplomacy. Canada refused to fall into the tariff trap, avoiding massive energy purchases or investment pledges to lower rates. Instead, it focused on internal resilience and supply security. The risks are significant. If 35% tariffs hit key sectors, costs will ripple across North America. Carney's refusal is more than defiance. It's a strategic wager on sovereignty built from within. As tensions mounted in negotiations, Trump's public statements inadvertently gave Canada a media edge. On July 25, 2025, Trump remarked, "We haven't prioritized a trade deal with Canada," suggesting it wasn't a true negotiation and hinting Canada might simply face tariffs. Yet, U.S. officials privately described talks as productive, revealing internal contradictions. This disconnect leaked to the press, weakening Washington's credibility. Canada capitalized on this. Ottawa portrayed the talks as one-sided, arguing that if negotiations fail, the blame lies with the U.S. Carney's team reinforced this narrative, emphasizing Canada's commitment to fair discussions in the days following Trump comments. They pointed to Washington's mixed signals as the real obstacle. This resonated widely, with outlets like The Guardian and The Washington Post noting how the U.S.'s inconsistent messaging diminished its leverage and cast Canada as the rational player globally. By late July, the Canadian dollar dipped by about 0.5%, partly due to fading deal prospects, but Ottawa used this to project a calm, steady image. This narrative shift gave Canada a platform, positioning it not as a defiant resistor, but as a prudent partner seeking stability from a divided U.S. side. Trump's remarks unintentionally handed Canada the moral high ground, blunting the impact of his 35% tariff threat, a textbook case of a diplomatic misstep. Now, let's connect the dots and explore how Canada transformed this tariff standoff into a strategic Arctic victory. In mid-March 2025, Prime Minister Carney introduced Bill C-5, a bold plan to expand Canada's northern presence. The legislation allocated over $6 billion Canadian dollars to Arctic infrastructure and sovereignty initiatives, including a new radar system with Australia. By late June, Bill C-5 gained royal assent, and provinces launched collaborative projects for ports, roads, and community-driven energy initiatives. Ottawa appointed its first Inuit ambassador and opened consulates in Greenland and Anchorage to enhance Indigenous-led diplomacy and Arctic connectivity. Instead of chasing U.S. tariff deals, Canada invested in tangible assets. The Arctic holds critical reserves of lithium, cobalt, and rare earth minerals essential for defense and clean technology. The U.S., meanwhile, relies on China for 70% of its rare earths, particularly those needed for military equipment and high-temperature magnets. By securing its supply chains and infrastructure, Canada indirectly challenged U.S. dependence, gaining influence in global mineral markets and diplomatic arenas. Carney's investments reshaped perceptions, presenting Canada as a proactive leader rather than a defensive player under U.S. pressure. This Arctic strategy turned Trump's tariff threats into a geopolitical miscalculation. While Washington focused on deals, Canada built lasting pathways, both physical and policy-driven, to strengthen sovereignty. Trump's trade war storm met Canada's Arctic calm, a calculated counterstrike leveraging domestic capacity, indigenous diplomacy, and resource control as the new frontier in North American trade. Following this Arctic focus, Canada doubled down on a long-term approach over a quick fix. By early April 2025, as Trump pushed for swift trade wins, Canada quietly scaled up domestic infrastructure. Ottawa committed $30.9 billion Canadian dollars over 4 years to bolster sovereignty, reindustrialize, and protect value chains. Rather than seeking a tariff rollback like the EU or Japan, Canada rewrote the rules. The One Canadian Economy Act, passed in late June under Bill C-5, eliminated interprovincial trade barriers, and accelerated infrastructure approvals. This provided structure, not panic, empowering provinces and indigenous leaders to drive projects on their terms. Canada's strategy stood out for its foresight, not reaction. While Trump chased deals, Canada built resilience. Where Washington used export bans and trade war threats, Ottawa strengthened its supply chain by reducing dependence and fostering domestic production. Canada aligned with local stakeholders, indigenous communities, and provinces to safeguard key sectors like auto, forestry, and critical minerals. They avoided ad hoc investment pledges to dodge tariffs, choosing to sign only when a deal aligned with their interests. This made Canada both resilient in resistance and adaptable in preparation. If Washington offers a fair, transparent deal, Ottawa is open to talks, but only on its own terms, not under pressure. Canada turned Trump's short-term, headline-driven approach into a one-sided game, crafting a sovereignty-first narrative through infrastructure and industrial strength. When Trump raised the threat of a 35% tariff, he expected Canada to buckle. Instead, he got silence. Not fear, not retreat, but a deliberate pause. While the EU rushed into trillion-dollar concessions, Canada chose a different path. Delay the deal, secure the homeland, and quietly build Arctic power. Carney didn't sign under duress. He set the terms on his timeline and turf. With no agreement and the tariff deadline looming, the leverage has shifted to Ottawa. What's next? Will Canada's patience force the U.S. to negotiate earnestly, or will Trump escalate and push Canada toward a last-minute retreat? And what about the Arctic? Could Canada's control of rare earths reshape North American power dynamics? This is no longer just about trade. It's about who controls the board when the rules change. What's your take? Should Canada hold firm for the right deal or sign quickly to avoid deeper economic harm? Share your thoughts in the comments, because the quietest player might just be shaping the end game.